Vitamin D is essential for us to be healthy, and we can obtain it from sunlight, certain food sources, and supplements. But I want to know, how much of that can we get from each of those three? How much sunlight do we need? How many hours, for example? How many mushrooms would we maybe need to eat? And do supplements really work? Well, it's quite a debated topic. So today I'm going to be speaking to a nutritionist to answer all the questions around this very vital vitamin. I'm excited to find out more about vitamin D. I know as humans that we can't survive without it, and if you have a deficiency as a child, it could lead to something called rickets. Although thankfully extreme deficiencies like that are very rare in the modern world. Although we could be lacking vitamin D without even knowing it. And as athletes, any small imbalances are always exacerbated due to the stress that we put on our bodies. And today it is the athlete perspective that I'm looking at this problem with. And it all arose from a conversation I had with Mark when he was just talking about in the winter months, he religiously takes vitamin D as a supplement and really finds it makes such a difference to him. Whereas I, on the other hand, have only taken the supplement through one winter, and that was as a result of the nutritionist insisting we took it, and it was just easier to go along with it rather than argue. So I want to find out if it is just a placebo or are there measurable effects from taking a supplement. I must admit, I have recently topped up my levels of vitamin D, and I've cheated a little bit. I've had some winter sun and I feel brilliant, although that could in part be due to the fact that I've had a few weeks off work with it. However, before we delve into the conversation around supplementation, I want to find out a little bit more about exactly what vitamin D does to our health and our bodies as a whole. I expect most of you are aware of vitamin D's importance when it comes to bone health. It's actually used to help our body absorb calcium and phosphorus, which is needed to build stronger bones. But earlier, I caught up with nutritionist Renee McGregor, who actually started off by explaining that vitamin D plays a far bigger role in our health than I realised. All right, so first things first, Renee, what does vitamin D actually do? Why is it so important for us?
So vitamin D, obviously for triathletes, runners, cyclists, it's important on so many levels. Firstly, we know that vitamin D is really important for our immune health. So there's been loads and loads of links that have shown that for those individuals where vitamin D is below par, it can really depress your immune system. And so we saw definitely prior to the science coming out about vitamin D, that those athletes that had low vitamin D tended to have a much higher prevalence of particularly respiratory tract infections in the winter months. And so then by giving them vitamin D through the winter and then them topping up over the summer with sunshine and exposure to the sun, they were the following year their incidence of illness went down. So vitamin D is really important for our immune health. But the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that it's also really, really important in muscular recovery. So the more training you do, the more vitamin D you're going to utilize. And this is, I think, why sometimes people are really surprised that they might be taking a low dose vitamin D, or maybe they've spent the summer outside and they're like, but I don't understand why my levels are still so low. And if you're an athlete that's training really hard, actually your body will be draining that source alongside quite quickly. And so one of the symptoms you might notice is, if you haven't got enough vitamin D, is that kind of recovery between training is poor. And also that you might notice you get a lot more muscle soreness. And sometimes you can even get myalgia. So like that kind of, like real muscle lethargy and pain. Like in severe cases that can happen, and we've identified quite a lot of athletes that we work with where they're sort of presenting with these symptoms of severe tiredness as they're walking through treacle, quite like pain, as if like it's some sort of autoimmune thing. And actually when we've done their blood tests, their vitamin D levels are just really, really low. So vitamin D is really important for that. And obviously the other reason why vitamin D is so important is for your bone health, which I think most people are aware of, and probably the only thing people are really aware of, and not the other two features. So it's a really, really vital nutrient in an athlete's diet.
And how much do you actually need if you had a blood test, how much should you have? So are there any numbers?
Yeah, so ideally for athletes or people who are physically very active, should we say, you want that number to be above 90. And, that's quite rare, actually. And so depending on where you're at in the scale, so if you are, say, between 50 and 90, then you probably need a dose of about 1,000 international units a day, particularly through the winter months. If you're much below 50, then we'd be probably giving you slightly higher dose, maybe something like 4,000 international units a day. And if you're like in the 20s, which I have had some athletes that are in the 20s, then you probably need some proper medical intervention, and you need some really pretty high dose supplements, which your doctor can give you. So and should be under medical supervision. So it does depend on where you're at in that scale.
And a lot of our viewers obviously aren't going to be having regular blood tests. So how would you know how much you need if you're not having a blood test?
It's really tricky, but I generally say to people, especially between the months of September and April, I would probably just have a kind of a low level dose. So I'd go for like the 1,000 international units a day, because it's very hard. Although there are some people who can overdose and you can get very, very high levels, it's very rare. In my practice, in my experience, I've only seen 2 athletes with very high levels, and that was just because they were taking really high doses and had also been in the sun and just didn't need to do it all. So it's quite hard to overdose. So I'd say a basic dose would be about 1,000 international units. If you maybe notice some of the other symptoms that we were talking about earlier, then I would encourage you to go and get a blood test somehow, or even use like one of the the biomarker companies that can just do the vitamin D on its own, and then at least that way it's not too big a cost out, but you have an idea of where you're at, because it's also slightly genetic to a certain degree as well. Like certain ethnic groups, for example, like the darker the skin you are, the more vitamin D you're going to need. Some people just don't have the ability to absorb vitamin D very well. So it's being mindful that there are situations where you might be taking it, but you're still not getting enough. And so that's where it would be useful to know where your numbers are. I know personally, my numbers always run quite low. And so I basically take vitamin D all year round because of that. But that's because I know my numbers run low.
Yeah, and you've touched on it there of the ability to absorb it. And I know some people even argue that you can't absorb it as a supplement. Are there any things you can do that can actually help you absorb it? Should you take it with a certain food or drink?
So ideally, you want to take it with, it's a fat soluble vitamin. So you should ideally try and take it with something that's going to help you absorb it. So fat, things like, peanut butter on toast when you have your vitamin D could be quite useful. And we do recommend that you try and have your vitamin D in the morning and not in the evening, because it does interfere with your production of melatonin. So some people tend to take it in the evening and then wonder why they can't sleep. So definitely try and take it in the morning. And yeah, like that. So I actually take it first thing in the morning, and usually take it first and then I eat, which tends to be the best way to do it.
And if you're not a fan of supplements, like I've never been a fan of supplements, and I don't actually take vitamin D. Obviously in normal years I do go away quite a lot, and I've been away now, but are there certain foods that we can eat that can actually help supplement us, or is it, in your mind, do you think everyone should take vitamin D?
It's a really good question. I think it's a difficult one. We know as a population study, majority of people, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, probably do need to take a vitamin D supplement through the winter months. And that's there's quite a lot of good data on that. But obviously some people who go away, maybe they're living in different parts of the world, they might not need to. And there are some foods that do give you vitamin D, but it's just quite hard to get the amounts you need. But the foods that you would sort of be reliant on would be things like sort of oily fish, the sort of bony oily fish, because that's very, very high in vitamin D. Some dairy products are fortified with vitamin D, so that can be quite useful. But there's not an awful lot of food that's going to give you vitamin D, which is the tricky bit. And that's why it's, I don't tend to recommend supplements in general, but it's the one supplement that is quite tricky to get through your diet if you're not careful.
Yeah, it was the one supplement that our nutritionist, actually, as the pentathlete, insisted we had to take, and it was non-negotiable, which I struggled with, but had to accept. And obviously in the summer you're saying we don't necessarily need to take it, and sunlight is a big factor, but are there any kind of, and I know it's such a broad spectrum because we've got people watching in all parts of the world with different latitudes, longitudes and different times of year, but is there a guidance as to how much sun and at what sort of angle or time of year that you need?
Yeah, so what they say is that to absorb the right amount of sunlight, it should be between the hours of 11 and 3, which already kind of makes it problematic for most office workers and people who are working. From the months of April to September is what we say in, obviously in the UK. And ideally for about 20 minutes is a kind of minimum. And you want that without any sun cream on. So you want to be sat outside and you want exposure basically to your face and your forearms is kind of what they say. So it's actually quite tricky, unless you're outside working and you remember to put your sun cream on, because obviously that's another aspect of it. Because they actually found that even though Australia has so much more sunlight, because of the amount of sun cream that they're always encouraged to use, their levels of vitamin D were still very low. So it's quite an interesting one. I think it's quite tricky to get it right. And I haven't yet found a formula to, but I think perhaps the key is trying to get out in a break, like a lunch break or something during those months, sit outside for 20 minutes and then go back in and then put your sun cream on. Is the only thing I can recommend. It's
a difficult one, isn't it? Because then you've got, doctors talking about skin cancer and skincare, but the health that you need vitamin D. So it sounds very tricky, but a great guidance there, Renee. Thank you very much. A big thanks to Renee for her time and her knowledge on that topic, and it just goes to show how important vitamin D is, and maybe I should have been less reluctant on taking that supplement back when I was an athlete. Now, I know you guys live all over the world, and some of you will be lucky enough to have enough sunshine to get your requirement of vitamin D. Just make sure you do so carefully, please. If you're stuck in the UK like us, then it's unlikely that the few daylight hours we do have are going to give you enough. So you might want to consider taking a supplement, but of course that is up to you. It's just so hard to know if you're having enough, because I mean, who feels great at this time of year? I know I don't, but if you do have the resources, then a blood test could be interesting. If you have had one in the past and you've found some interesting results, or maybe you were really struggling with training and you started taking vitamin D and found a notable difference in how you felt and how you could train, please do let us know. I think it's a really interesting topic, so share your thoughts and your comments in the comments section below, and hopefully you've enjoyed this, you've learned something like I have. Give us a like if so, and remember, you can follow us on our social media channels, and you can also subscribe to us here on YouTube.